Hi, everyone. Hey, welcome to the teaching on Lesson 8, A Jealous King and a Loyal Friend. So a husband and wife were celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. And the husband says, "Honey, on our 25th, I'm going to take you to China." The wife was so excited she could hardly stand it. "Oh, darling, it's so exciting. And if you're going to take me to China on our 25th, what will you do on our 50th? Pick you up." Okay, so moving right along. This is the outline I'll be using for today. Chapter 18, Success and Failure. Chapter 19, Foes. And Chapter 20, Friends. So last week, David was secretly anointed as the next king of Israel. And though I'm not sure he really understood the significance of it at the time, and while the king and his army were shaking in their boots, he bravely went out to the valley of Elah, and with a shepherd's sling slew the mighty Goliath in front of everyone. Definitely the Lord had come upon David in power. Now the story for this week continues with David joining King Saul's court on a permanent basis. And it's here that a great friendship developed between David, the son of a sheep herder, and Jonathan, King Saul's son and heir to the throne. Well, they were certainly different in that sense, but as we see as the story unfolds, they were similar in that they both were full of courage, idealism, and faith. Verse 1 says that Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. They formalized their friendship with a promise to each other, a covenant that would bind them together through thick and thin, success and failure. And as one commentator put it, a friendship that is one of the most noble relationships in the Bible. Jonathan wasn't the only person that gravitated towards David. Whatever Saul sent him to do, he did it successfully, so he gave him a high rank in the army, and everyone was pleased. Well, after a particularly successful engagement with the Philistines, the women came out to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, and one of their lyrics stuck in the craw of Saul. You know it. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And verse 9 says, "And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David." Yeah, I'm reminded of an old fable that appeared in Moody's Anecdotes many years ago. And it goes like this. There was an eagle which could outfly another, and the other didn't like it. The latter saw a hunter one day and said to him, "I wish you would bring down that eagle." Well, the hunter replied, he would if only he had some feathers to put onto his arrow. So the eagle pulled out one of his wings and gave him a feather. Well, the arrow was shot, but it didn't quite reach the rival eagle. It was flying too high. Well, the jealous eagle pulled out more feathers and kept pulling them out until he lost so many that he couldn't fly. And then the hunter turned toward him and killed him. Okay, well, the moral of the tale is if you're jealous, the only person you can really hurt is yourself. So let's see how this plays out for King Saul, shall we? The next day, in one of his evil spells, he picks up his spear and throws it at David, not once, but twice. Verse 12 says, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. And this is a kind of a key driver for the rest of our lesson today, and it kind of follows Saul into subsequent lessons as well. Saul begins to plot the death of David, not by his own hand, but by putting him in harm's way, letting the Philistines do his dirty work. Well, he put David in command of 1,000 troops and sent him on a series of military campaigns, and in everything David did, he had great success. Why? Well, verse 14 says, because the Lord was with him. The hand of God was surely directing him there. David avoids getting married to daughter number 1. Saul tries to use the love of daughter number 2 to trap David into a suicide mission to collect 100 Philistine soldiers' foreskins, while David comes back with double the amount. David becomes married to Michal, daughter number 2. When Saul realized that his daughter loved David and that the Lord was with him, he continued to send David out into the heat of battle. And the chapter ends with verse 30. David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. In a publication from In the Word some years ago, there was a missionary family, the Pattons, in the New Hebrides Islands, and they were saved from certain death. One night, hostile natives surrounded the mission, intent on burning them out and killing them. Well, Patton and his wife prayed during that night and that God would deliver them. Well, when daylight came, they were amazed to see their attackers had left. Well, a year later, the chief of that tribe was converted to Christianity. And remembering what happened, Patton asked the chief what had kept him from burning down the house and killing them. Well, the chief replied in surprise, "Who were all those men that were there with you?" Well, Patton knew there were no men present, but the chief said he was afraid to attack because he had seen hundreds of big men in shining garments with drawn swords circling the mission station. God had somehow intervened, going before the Pattons in their most desperate hour. Well, in all of the court intrigue, flying spears, and battles with the Philistines, and in personal relationships, the Lord went before David, no matter what the circumstance, and because the Lord was with him. And God is with us too, and goes before us, no matter what we might face. So David has enjoyed God's presence with him and all of his successes, even avoiding a couple of spears. But now he must find that same God in persecution and threat of imminent death. Chapter 19 begins with Saul's order to kill David, uttered in front of all the attendants and his son Jonathan. Well, Jonathan, who's very fond of David, warns him. And in the meantime, he says he's going to find out if his father is really serious. He reasons that David has done no wrong and, in fact, has been a great help to Saul through his victories and the killing of the giant Goliath. So Saul relents, and things go back to a normal situation. Now, many commentators believe there's a significant amount of elapsed time between verses 7 and 8. Now, when the writer says, once more, war broke out. Now, fast forward to Saul making another failed attempt to kill David with a spear. Well, David senses the reality that Saul really does want to kill him. And it's not just another one of his spells. It seems to be much more. Saul sends men to David's house to arrest him, but they run into an unexpected situation. Michal, David's wife, the king's daughter, deceives them with an idol topped with goat hair covered with a blanket in David's bed. "He's ill," she says. Well, David escapes out the window and flees to Ramah to meet up with Samuel. And there he's protected against 3 contingents of men sent to kill him, as the Spirit of God came upon them, even on Saul, as he again tried to take matters into his own hand. The chapter ends with, Saul naked on the ground prophesying in Samuel's presence. So, is Saul among the prophets? Well, I think we can safely say no. David navigated no less than 6 attempts on his life, 1 by Saul in the palace, 2 in his home, 3 in Naioth at Ramah, and a last gasp attempt by Saul himself. There's an excellent Think About It section in the commentary about trusting God under pressure, and be sure to read that. Now, as we leave this chapter behind, I'm struck how King Saul's envy of David developed into intense jealousy to the point of wanting him dead, and then acting on that hate. Gary Collins, in his commentary on these deadly emotions, says there's a distinction between jealousy and envy. To envy is to want something which belongs to another person. You might remember one of the commandments, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house, wife, maidservant, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Well, in contrast, jealousy is the fear that something we possess will be taken away by another person. That's an interesting thought. Although jealousy can apply to our jobs, our possessions, or our reputations, the word more often refers to anxiety, which comes when we're afraid that the affections of a loved one might be lost to a rival. We fear that our mates or perhaps our children will be lured away by some other person who, when compared to us, seems to be more attractive, capable, and successful. Well, that pretty much describes Saul's state of mind when he said to David, what more can he get but the kingdom? Now, the Life Application Study Bible says that jealousy may not seem to be a major sin, but in reality, it is one step short of murder. Now, in my slide, it's 2 steps, but okay. According to the gospel writer John, in one of his letters, 1 John chapter 3, he says, "For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Whoever does not love abides in death, and everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him." This is right where we find Saul. And the message for us is, I think, pretty obvious. Beware of letting envy take root and blossom into jealousy. And left unchecked, it leads to hatred and death. In the last section, chapter 20, the friendship between David and Jonathan is tested. And here's a brief recap. The section begins with an argument. Well, let's call it a spirited exchange between David and Jonathan. David, protesting his innocence, said that Saul was trying to kill him for no reason. Amazingly, Jonathan wasn't buying it. "Never. It's not so," he replied. Well, you may be wondering how Jonathan could be so naive as to miss something so obvious to the casual reader. Now, here again, the chronology of the events and the timing most likely did not take place like in rapid sequence, making room for time to have elapsed between the end of chapter 19 and the beginning of chapter 20. Well, as for Jonathan, I like what Ken Chafin in his commentary says here. There is no sense that Jonathan was, there is a sense that Jonathan was trapped between his love for his father and his love for his friend. The really good thing about Jonathan, beyond his loyalty, was that rare and prized ability to trust people and put the most charitable construction on their motives and intentions. Gosh, I wish more people were like that. Well, the same spirit that made it easy for him to believe in his friend's innocence also made it difficult for him to believe his father's guilt. Well, for me, the key learning from this part of the passage is that friendship and family will sometimes face tests, but honesty about fears and anxieties don't have to destroy those relationships. Actually, I believe it's kind of necessary for healthy well-being of these relationships. In friends or family, if they can't be honest with each other about things of great importance, those relationships will always be superficial. I'll come back to this point in just a little bit later, so park that thought. So to resolve the difference of opinion regarding Saul's intentions for David, the two of them devised a plan to get at the heart of the matter. David was to hide out in a nearby field during the celebration of the new moon. And when Saul was told by Jonathan that David was in Bethlehem and that Jonathan had given David permission to go, Saul made his intentions very clear. Verse 30 says, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan. "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman." Yeah, we've shortened that phrase quite a bit, haven't we? "Well, bring the son of Jesse to me, for he must die." Well, instead of arguing with his father, Jonathan tries to reason with him, asking what David has done to deserve death. Well, Saul at his worst, Jonathan at his best. And as the lawyer might say, for the absence of doubt, Saul gave him his answer. He picked up a spear and threw it at Jonathan to kill him. Well, the chapter ends with David and Jonathan reassuring each other of their love and their covenant pledge as they said their goodbyes. Well, during the pandemic, following the last presidential election, I was in Deer Park, Washington, visiting my brother, his wife, my daughter-in-law, and my dearest friend from childhood and best man in our wedding. You know, we had just gotten back from a football game in Pullman where USC clobbered the Washington State Cougars. Well, the negative mood of the loss carried over into the discussion that evening of vaccinations, January 6th, contested elections, and things just sort of spiraled downhill from there. It was a spirited exchange, to say the least, and pent-up passion was expressed on both sides of these issues to the point just shy of personalization. Believe me, I'm sugarcoating it here. It was not our finest hour. Well, the next morning, the true and honest exchange took place between me and my brother. Our relationship had been severely tested the night before, but our love for each other trumped our differences in opinion. Our parting was not without tears and a promise to always remain true to each other. Now, I believe the Lord was watching over us that weekend, going before us, protecting us even from ourselves, as he so often does. Much like God watching over David, going before him in battle with the Philistines, dealing with a jealous king and his minions in a test of loyalty with his dear friend Jonathan. So what battles are you facing today? Try to remember what Moses told the people as they were preparing to enter the promised land. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. You know, God goes before us no matter what we might face. Will you choose to trust God, that he goes before you no matter what you might face? Okay, see you next week.